Hello again, everyone. Hello, hello, and welcome back. Our next session features three wonderful colleagues from campus who will share more about the financial importance of current use unrestricted dollars, such as those given to the Alumni Fund and Parents Fund, how important they are to the college's financial model, and the impact that they have, particularly within the financial aid program. First, our Provost and Class of 1955 Memorial Professor of History, Eiko Maruko Siniawer, a member of the Class of 1997, and Mike Wagner, Vice President for Finance and Operations and College Treasurer. Eiko has been with Williams since 2003, and as a historian specializes in the history of modern Japan. Her research in that area is both really fascinating and also not the subject of today's presentation. As Provost, Eiko oversees areas of campus such as admission and financial aid, the libraries, WICMA, and the Zilka Center, and she's also responsible for establishing budget priorities and institutional planning. Mike has been with Williams since 2021. Prior to that, he served as Chief Financial Officer at Dartmouth College, where he led the financial planning, budgeting, treasury, reporting, and business operations activities, while closely collaborating with academic and administrative leaders. He also regularly led a course for students, faculty, and staff called Inside Dartmouth's Budget. And though their title today is slightly different, I'm confident that Mike and Eiko will give you a guided tour of the Williams budget through their presentation. They'll be immediately followed by Liz Creighton, Class of 2001, who has served as Dean of Admission and Student Financial Services since 2017. In her role, Liz laid the groundwork for and oversaw the college's transition to the first in the nation all-grant financial aid program in 2022. And though Liz is, and has been for quite a long time, a very accomplished basketball player, I'm confident that the creation of the all-grant program was a slam dunk, is a slam dunk. It may very well be her first, but it is definitely something we're all very proud of. So please join me in welcoming Mike, Eiko, and Liz.
What Mike and I will be doing is talking about the college's financial model, a little bit about strategic priorities, and then Liz will do a kind of deeper dive into our commitment to access and affordability through true affordability. So we'll start with the college's financial model. And I think what is really key to understanding the college's finances is just kind of the fundamentals of what our revenues are and what our expenses are. So starting with the expenses, the largest expense category is for people, that is salaries and benefits. That makes sense. Higher education is a really resource-intensive and people-centered enterprise, so that makes sense. The next wedge is what we call managers' budgets. You can think of as little like departmental budgets. It includes a wide variety of things. So, equipment in labs, books in the library, food in the dining halls, the natural gas we currently use to heat our campus, all of that is under manager's budget. Then the next wedge here is buildings, and it has two parts. That's renewal, so addressing the deferred maintenance on our physical plant, on our buildings. And the debt, that's the annual debt payment on debt that we have taken out for capital projects, so for building projects. And there's a small amount of other. Then on the revenue side, a draw from the endowment, or what we call the endowment avail, funds over half of what we do at Williams. We treat the avail as a kind of plug between the rest of our revenue sources and our expenses. And our kind of guiding principle is that we don't draw more than 5% of the value of the endowment over time. This is to ensure that we're not eroding the purchasing power of the endowment, and that our future selves will have every opportunity to pursue their aspirations as we do. I mentioned that we are quite, that 55% number makes us quite endowment dependent. There's only a handful of institutions that are as reliant on the endowment as we are. Amherst, Swarthmore, the undergraduate parts of Princeton would be in this same category. Tuition is also an important source of revenue. So if you take gross tuition, so that would be if every student were paying the full sticker price, you subtract out financial aid. We kind of treat financial aid as contra revenue, but that $82 million is our expenditure on our investment in financial aid. That leaves the net tuition revenue. Gifts. This is where the annual giving is really, really important. So these gifts are annual giving, and also current use gifts will be in this category. Also very important. Relatively small amount of other. So if you look at our financial model, maybe there are a couple of observations to make. One is that there aren't all that many levers to turn, to pull when times are tough. The other thing to note is just how important philanthropy and careful endowment management are to what we do. So the philanthropy you'll see in the revenue pie in the gifts wedge, but also in gifts to the endowment as well. So that's just to underscore the importance of giving and endowment management.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you, and thank you, Laura, for inviting us. These next two slides are going to take you the similar revenues and expenses that Eiko just talked about, but is taking you over time, over the last 20 years. These are also net of inflation, so this is displaying real growth in expenses on this first slide and real growth in revenues on the second slide. The third thing I will mention about these slides is the accounting is a little different, where we're showing financial aid here as one of our expenses. It's not really an expense, but it is an allocation of resources. And what we wanted to demonstrate here is that net of inflation, financial aid, the commitment to financial aid has been by far the fastest growing allocation of resources for Williams over the last 20 years. In total, all of the resource allocation has grown by 2.1% above inflation, but you can see that financial aid is quite a bit more at 4.8%. And the people piece of the pie, 1.7, represents new positions on the faculty and staff over that 20 years, being competitive with the market above inflation and things like that. So that's what that is, just illustrating where the money has been going in the growth of the budget. The next slide is just showing the funding sources for that. And a couple of key takeaways here are that the gross tuition depicted here, student charges, has grown 1.7% above inflation over this period of time. So that's, again, not with the deduction for financial aid. So this would be if every student had paid full comprehensive fee for all 20 years, it would have grown by 1.7% more than inflation over that period of time. The only way we've been able to balance the budget, as you can tell, is from growth in the draw on the endowment over this period of time, that 2.9% above inflation. And one important metric to think about, Eiko mentioned that we're at 55% endowment dependent in this last bar in 2023-24. In the first bar, Williams was 43% dependent on the endowment. So by shifting the mix of tuition and financial aid and becoming more more endowment dependent, that's been the result, is going from 43 to 55% over that time.
Right. One important thing to note about our model is that even the student paying the full comprehensive fee is not covering the cost of their education. So we spend about $135,000 per student. So that means that even the full pay student is receiving a subsidy of about $54,000. And then if you look at the price paid by the average student, so that's both full pay and aided students, the average subsidy is about $95,000. So how do we do this? We are able to do it, again, because of the generous gifts, and also because of the endowment. So that is just, again, reiterating the point about the importance of both philanthropy and the endowment. If you compare our subsidy per student to other institutions, you'll see we're in pretty good company there with Amherst, Swarthmore, Bowdoin. And again, this kind of gives you an indication of what our endowment enables us to do in terms of the educational experience for our students. This is looking at real growth in the net tuition revenue over time. So you'll notice that net tuition revenue has declined over the last 10 years, declined even more steeply over the last 5 years. This reflects the kind of commitment that we have made and investment that we have made in financial aid. I would add here as a kind of related note that, while you might read headlines about the spiraling price of higher education, if you look at the average net price, so what on average student pays to attend Williams, if you adjust that for inflation over the last 20 years, the average net price today is actually lower than it was 20 years ago. And if you look at that for the student on financial aid, it's actually half of what it was 20 years ago. So that's just to say that Williams doesn't fit so neatly into headlines you might read about kind of spiraling price of higher education. This looks at current use, annual current use gifts, again adjusted for inflation. You'll notice the bottom is the Alumni Fund. The top bar is all other current giving. So that will also reflect kind of gifts, outside gifts that are given in any given year, bequest, and so on. But if you look at that trend line, there's been a decline over the last 10 years, and again, a steeper decline over the last 5 years in annual giving. This is very much in keeping with the national trend, and I would add to that that the decline that we're seeing at Williams is not as great as that at peer institutions and also nationally.
So these slides so far have been about revenues and expenses. The next couple of slides will be a little bit about our capital structure of the college. This first one, the bars depict the height of the bars depicts the value of the endowment. So the very far bar is fiscal 23 year end at about $3.5 billion. You can see the high point was at the end of fiscal 21, when we had just experienced a 49% investment return, -11 in fiscal 22, and +3 in fiscal 23. The three things that change the height of this bar every year are, first of all, gifts to the endowment, not the current use gifts that Eiko was just referring to, and not gifts toward bricks and mortar construction of buildings, but to the endowment itself. Those gifts increase the value of the endowment. Investment return, which can go either direction depending upon the market returns, and then that draw from the endowment, which is about $160 million will come out of the endowment each year. So that's what's changing the height of that bar. The one other thing I'll mention from a policy perspective that we do is that Eiko mentioned the 5% draw, which is a long-term aim of the financial model, is that over time we will draw 5% from the endowment. But each year it could be a little bit different, and we don't try to hit 5% of every year, which you can see from that really high bar in 2021. We wouldn't want to try to have the budget equal that 5% of that number, and then the next year have it a much smaller number. That kind of volatility would just whipsaw the budget around too much. So what we do is we aim for, in our budgeting process, around 5% of a 12-quarter average, 12-quarter trailing average. So it allows us to smooth in the changes in the endowment over time. This next slide is a really important slide. This metric for well-endowed institutions is probably the most important metric, which is endowment per student. And there's a direct correlation between this number and the 5% draw and the subsidy that Eiko was referring to. If you take 5% of Williams' $1.6 million per student, that's $80,000. That's about what that subsidy was that Eiko was referring to earlier, even for the full pay students. The other thing I'll mention is that the experience, if you were to sort of do a detailed analysis of each one of these schools and say, what are you getting for the $80,000 subsidy or the $130,000 average cost of being at Williams versus Middlebury, Wesleyan, or Oberlin, you could find a lot of things that are different around the student-faculty ratio, the health services, mental health services, the size of the physical plant, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just an interesting thing to think about. What does that subsidy go to, and what is the cost paying for? This is the other part of our capital structure, is debt. There's a lot on this that I'm not going to talk too much, but a couple of quick things. The pie on the lower left is, this pointer isn't working, the pie in the lower left is showing that virtually all of the college's debt is tax-exempt debt, which is good. We get that for a lower price than if it was taxable. The pie to the right is showing that most of it is fixed rate debt, and the piece that is variable is actually swapped to a fixed rate debt through a swap transaction. The other thing that this slide and this, oh, the other slide isn't here, is showing is that you can see we have $350 million of debt outstanding right now, and some of the aspirations for the future include needing to borrow over the next 3 to 5 years, next 1, 3, and 5 years. So we have plenty of capacity for that. One of the rating agencies just reaffirmed the college's AA+ credit rating, so we're preparing for that as part of our future financial planning.
All right, you've been hearing about the college's kind of strategic priorities, so I'm not going to go into any of these in great depth, but just do a kind of thumbnail sketch. So in terms of strategic priorities, Liz will be talking more about our commitment to true affordability and the all-grant financial aid program in particular, which again is no loans in financial aid packages, no summer earnings expectation, and no campus work requirement. And Liz will be talking more about the kind of impact that the program has had. We also have a very strong commitment to arts education, and in kind of hand in hand with that, a new home for our Williams College Museum of Art. And this new museum is really, I think, an extension of what's been an evolution on campus with teaching about and with art throughout the curriculum. So if you look at the more than 100 classes that were held at the museum in the last year, they represent over 30 departments and programs of the college. So it is computer science and math and sociology as well as art history. So that's really a kind of extension of our commitment to arts education. There's also kind of early stages of a conversation about what will happen with the space in Lawrence Hall when the museum vacates Lawrence Hall. We're looking at a very student experience centered integrative arts program or interdisciplinary arts program. Other strategic priorities, so academic innovation and vitality. We're always investing in kind of academic innovation. I know that you heard about the Global Scholars Program, so I won't talk much more about that. There's also commitment to kind of learning by doing, experiential education as well. Also student experience, athletics, and well-being. We're in the early stages of kind of programming for athletics and well-being facilities. I should add to that the plan for athletics and well-being facilities is to fund that 100% through fundraising. Also early stages of thinking about dining and residence hall renewal as well. In terms of sustainability, there are two really important commitments in sustainability, or the ways that we think about sustainability. One is through the curriculum. So we have a strong environmental studies program, which offers a broad array of courses about the environment, co-curricular program as well. The other thing that we try to do is to model environmental responsibility through campus sustainability initiatives. The largest of those projects is our campus energy transformation. That is a decarbonization of our campus, at the heart of which is a project to move our heating plant off of fossil fuels. Also a commitment to non-traditional students, so students who have followed a non-linear path to Williams, so community college transfer students, military veterans. These are students who bring great experiential diversity to Williams. They also often require more support, both financially in terms of financial aid packages, and also support systems on campus. And there's also the kind of added challenge of housing for older students, some of whom come with families. So we'll wrap up by reiterating the kind of principles that we've been talking about. One is to prioritize the college's financial health and sustainability over the long term. So we are quite rigorous in kind of modeling out, doing projections for 10 years and beyond. We are also always aligning both our annual spending and our capital spending with the college's core educational mission and the strategic initiatives that we've just outlined. Another thing to underscore is our kind of approach to endowment returns, which is that we treat endowment returns as funding our current commitments, our commitments today. And that means that any new initiatives are going to require new revenue. That's either through fundraising or through reallocation of resources. But because a lot of that has to do with fundraising, this is the last bullet point, is also the importance of encouraging and also supporting philanthropy as a way of funding our core educational priorities and strategic initiatives. All right, I'll turn it over to Liz now, who will talk about one of those important initiatives and commitments, being the true affordability and the all-grant financial aid program.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see many of you. Some folks who I've had a chance to see on the West Coast and down in New York earlier this week, and I'm grateful to all of you for traveling here to hear more about what's going on at Williams today, and enormously grateful to all of you for all that you've done to put us in a position for me to talk to you about our efforts around true affordability. So as Eiko said, this has been one of the sort of central pillars of the college's strategic plan, and something we've been working towards since I stepped into this role in 2017 and Maud's arrival soon after. So I'm really excited to talk about some of the early results of our commitment in this area, but thought before I did I might just talk a bit about sort of this moment in time. So it's May, which means it's also the height of admission decision-making season. We have admitted the class of 2028. They are deciding whether or not they're going to enroll. And this has been a particularly sort of exciting admission season in that there's a lot that's going on nationally. Lots of external factors that have changed and informed the way we've done our work this year. So I thought I might just give you a little journey through what it's like to be in my head over this past admission cycle. So this is just a quick sense. So much swirling around us in the broader higher ed landscape, some of which directly impacts us at Williams, other things which have a less sort of direct impact here, but are certainly swirling in the minds of students and families, and therefore which we need to consider. And just a few that I'll mention. So I'm sure many of you are aware of the Supreme Court's decision in a case last year in which they ruled that colleges can no longer consider a student's racial or ethnic identity as a factor in a holistic admission process. So that was a sort of monumental shift for us. Despite the court's decision in this area, Williams remains committed to enrolling a student body that is diverse across many dimensions: racial and ethnic diversity, socioeconomic diversity, experiential diversity, as Eiko just mentioned, geographic diversity, ideological thought. So we have had to think long and hard about how we might adapt our process to respond to some of the new legal guardrails that are in place while still supporting the goals that the college has. During COVID, a lot of schools, Williams among them, introduced test optional admission pilots, so began giving students the opportunity to apply without standardized test scores if they chose to. We are at Williams in the midst of a 6-year test optional admission pilot, so looking ahead to next year when the first class of students who had the opportunity to apply test optional will have completed a full 4-year experience at Williams, and so we're deep in analysis to understand if there are differentials in the experiences and outcomes for students who apply with standardized testing versus those who don't. If so, what those differentials are, and what impact they might have on the experience that students have here and the people we send them out into the world hoping they will be. Certainly, ChatGPT and other AI tools are weighing heavily on our minds right now. This is sort of an interesting aspect of the admission process because as I've mentioned in some other settings, we are just sort of in the admission world in a space on a continuum that is thinking about ChatGPT right now. So certainly K through 12 education, thinking about, responsible ways to introduce AI into K-12 curricula. Our own faculty are thinking long and hard about what role AI should play in courses at Williams, what that means for the evolution of the honor code here. And so we are really in the admission process trying to understand, what experience are students bringing to the admission process around AI? When they enroll at Williams, what expectations will they live within when it comes to things like ChatGPT? And how then do we evolve our process in response to that? Another thing, as we've been considering all these other changes that has been sort of in the background, is rampant grade inflation across the US. So right now, nearly 55% of grades that are given at American high schools are A's. So when my own kids come home happy about an A on a test, I obviously outwardly commend them, but inwardly think, yeah, you and half the other kids in your class too. But obviously, as we're thinking about things like AI and test optional admissions, we're doing so against a backdrop in which high school's transcripts are at some moments less meaningful or less telling than they once were. And then lastly, I'm sure some of you have read about what I will call a debacle with the free application for federal student aid, so a financial aid form that all families who are interested in applying for financial aid at U.S. colleges must complete. There was a rollout of a new form this year which went horribly wrong, and so we have been trying to think about what could Williams do in its own financial aid process to ensure that the commitments we have to true affordability could be realized even amidst so much chaos in the broader national financial aid landscape. So we were considering all that in a moment when we received a record number of admission applications, so 15,500 applications this year for the class of 2028, which we hope will end up at 560 students. So when I'm speaking with alumni, I always like to assure everyone we all still would have gotten in if we applied today. But it is a very different scene than it was even 10 years ago. And I always say, I relish the fact that Williams has been able to expand its reach, that we've opened up the applicant pool to students who were not well represented when many of us attended Williams, first-generation college students, low-income students, students from historically underrepresented racial and ethnic backgrounds. But that growth has also meant that we have to say no to more terrific students, and that is not something I relish. So, we talk a lot in our office about the importance of being both judicious in the decisions we make, but also finding ways to honor the really terrific work that these talented students have done. And so just a little bit about who those students are who end up coming to Williams today. So we're hovering right around 2,200 students. So as I mentioned, targeting a first-year class right now of between 550 and 560 students. And then we have seen a little bit of growth in the student body because those non-traditional students that Eiko talked about represent additional students on campus. Right now we have about 35 of them, and we are slowly working towards a steady state of about 50 non-traditional students on campus at any given time. You'll see we're close to gender parity. We've seen growth in the number of students attending Williams from public schools. Mentioned non-traditional students. Right now, 53% of all students receive financial aid. 1 out of every 5 receive federal Pell Grants, which is sort of an external indicator of students coming from the highest need backgrounds. 15% are part of the first in their family to attend college. I haven't updated this. I think we're up to 49 states because we enrolled a student from South Dakota just last week. North Dakota continues to elude us, but we're working on it. So 49 states, 93 countries. I mentioned before significant application growth A lot of that growth has been from students who are studying outside the US, so nearly 40% of the applicant pool at this point comes from international students. And you can see that plays out in other dimensions of diversity in terms of languages spoken, religious and spiritual traditions. And then this is among US students. So right now, about 10% of the overall student body are international students. And this is a breakdown of the racial and ethnic identities of students who are US citizens. So the demographics of the student body have changed quite a bit, even since my arrival at Williams 25 years ago, and certainly over the last half century or so. Okay, so this is who our students are, and both when Maud first arrived and then in the strategic planning process that ensued, one of the questions we really wanted to ask was, we're doing all this work to enroll this tremendously talented group of students. Are we delivering on sort of the promise we've made to give them opportunities to take advantage of all that Williams has to offer? And so in order to get a sense of that, we started doing some analysis to understand how students and families were feeling about paying for Williams. And so I just wanted to show you a little of that information. So we surveyed parents and asked them a lot of questions, one of which was, what's been the impact of paying for your child to attend Williams? So we cut that data by household income among those families. And what you can see here is that families who we describe as middle income at Williams, so those who earn between about $75,000 and $200,000 annually, felt the greatest pain in affording the cost of a Williams experience. And so we knew that we had been doing good work, sort of putting financial aid interventions in place to best support our lowest income students. But what we found was that we were maybe falling a bit shy of extending that same level of support to students from middle income backgrounds. We also asked students how they were experiencing Williams and the extent to which the cost of Williams was impacting choices they were making. And we learned some interesting things. So more than a third of seniors reported that they had made some decisions about exploring internship or research opportunities because of financial pressures that they felt. And we saw that in some of the other programs that existed on campus. So I know many of you are aware of and have supported the alumni-sponsored internship program. But you can see that we were seeing just enormous increase in demand for students who wanted to pursue either low-paid or non-paid internships and needed the support of the alumni-sponsored internship program in order to do so. So significant increase in demand, and we couldn't meet that demand. And that really got us thinking about what might a path towards not just making Williams affordable, but true affordability, making sure that every student at Williams, regardless of their financial circumstances, could avail themselves of all of the opportunities that exist here. And so we started chipping away at it. The first thing we did was began paying for health insurance and storage for students. Those might seem like small things, but these are the kinds of sort of hidden costs that actually represent significant barriers to students as they're thinking about moving through Williams. In 2019, we established something called the Critical Needs Fund, which is a centralized fund that students can request funding from to help cover acute financial emergencies. So they're studying in Sawyer late at night, they sit on their glasses, they can't keep studying without new glasses, so funding is available for that. Perhaps they have to get home. If there's a family member who's ill at home and they need to get home in short order, we can provide funding to help them book those plane tickets, things like that. In 2020, you may have noticed on one of the charts that Mike and Eiko shared, we made a decision to, during the pandemic, reduce the cost of attendance at Williams by 15%, in acknowledgement of the fact that the experience that students were having was a different one. And along with that, we reduced the parental contribution, the amount we were asking aided families to contribute, by 15%. We made some additional changes to our sort of financial aid methodology in 2021, and that culminated in 2022 in the announcement of the all-grant financial aid program. And just to give you a sense, over these 4 short years, we first invested an additional $4 million into the financial aid budget, followed by another $6.5 million annual investment to support all grants. So just in 4 to 5 short years, an additional investment of north of $10 million to ensure that we could offer the nation's first all-grant financial aid program. As Eiko mentioned, just very quickly, what all-grant means for students is that their financial aid packages are made up entirely of grants that need not be paid back. So they are not asked to take out loans. They are not asked to hold a campus job. They are not asked to contribute from any of the earnings they make in a summer job towards the cost of attendance. And again, the real sort of thing that we're trying to deliver is not just equal access on the admission front to Williams, but for students once they enroll, making sure there's equal participation in everything that goes on here. So I wanted to share just a little bit about how this has played out for students. So the first thing I'll say, because Laura mentioned I was a basketball player at Williams, and my competitive spirit has followed me into my work in admission and financial aid. Just a few months after we announced our all-grant financial aid program, Princeton followed suit and announced the second all-grant financial aid program. I commend them for doing good work and the right thing. I'm also thrilled that we did it first. And, this has been, I think, for me in this role, one of the most exciting things about working at Williams over these past few years is thanks to generous support from alumni, thanks to careful, thoughtful stewardship of the endowment, we have been in a position to really act as a leader in higher ed, to do work that we think is the kind of work that all colleges should be doing. Now, certainly not every college has the resources that we do, but we are trying to use the resources that we are fortunate enough to have to make decisions that really start steering higher ed more broadly in directions that are best for students. So a little bit about what all grant has meant here. So this is a sort of before and after of what families by income bracket were asked to pay in order to send their child to Williams before all grant and after. And you'll see the asterisks down there. One thing I wanted to mention is that the vast majority of students at Williams who come from families that have either no income or a small amount of income each year pay nothing to attend. So this is the 0 to 50K group is a relatively small population, mostly of self-employed people who have low reported income, but some assets. It always sticks out as a sore thumb on this slide. But you can see we've made just tremendous progress for families across the income spectrum, dialing down what we are asking them to pay. So, at a minimum, a 20% reduction, and in some cases, families are paying half and even 3/4 less than what they used to. In terms of changes in sort of student behavior on campus, I mentioned that we did away with the requirement to work. And what we've seen, and this is actually exactly what we expected to see. So previously, 83% of students on campus worked. The vast majority of students are still working, and that is not at all surprising to us. These kids come to Williams and are successful here because they have tremendous work ethics, and many of them find great joy in working. But what we've seen is that students are working in different kinds of positions. So they're engaging more in things like TAing with a professor, doing research with a professor, and have moved away from positions that are sort of more operational in nature. So working in the dining hall or working with facilities. Certainly there are some students who are still doing those things, but more are choosing to spend their working hours on work experiences that sort of extend learning that they're doing in the classroom. Among those who are working, the median number of hours they work has also decreased. And again, this was something that we expected to see and hoped to see. So we wanted to give students the opportunity to do work in the kinds of positions that were most interesting to them and to work the amount of hours that felt right to them. And interestingly, even though they're working less, students are actually working more, which actually has more to do with Massachusetts increases in minimum wage than anything else. But what you see here is that our students who are on financial aid and benefiting from All Grant, it used to be that these dollars earned immediately went back to the college. They had to use them to help pay their bill, to cover the cost of their plane ticket to and from campus. And now this is money that they keep in their pocket. And it gives them the opportunity to use those resources in different ways. So just a couple of things. So just on the sort of intersection of admission and financial aid, what we find is more than 3/4 of students tell us that the existence of the All Grant program was a significant factor in their decision to enroll at Williams. And I always say, the reason that we implemented All Grant was because we wanted to ensure the best experience for the students we have. But selfishly, given that I'm also responsible for the admission side of things, I'm thrilled that prospective students are also seeing it as a reason to consider at Williams. You can see students have told us that they have just more time to consider the things that they're interested in, their goals, rather than worrying about finances. They have more time to spend on things like their mental and emotional wellness. I'm sure many of us have been following the sort of mental health crisis in American schools today, and especially in higher ed. And so this feels really significant that students feel like they have more time to be intentional about taking advantage of their time here and doing so in a way that allows them to be healthy. And then lastly, given this lovable set of geeks that we have, they're using this time that we've freed up to spend more time hanging with faculty in office hours, more time studying, more time doing things like taking tutorials and writing theses. And I thought I might just end with, I talk a lot about I'm repeating to folks about what students tell me, but I thought it might be nice to hear just in 2 students' words. So this was from a junior, you can see, talks about the removal of the summer earnings contribution, so the previous need to earn money in the summer and then use it to help pay your bill at Williams. And this student talks about how it gave them the chance to explore internships that they couldn't have explored previously. And I just found out that this student got into med school for next fall, so I know some of the sort of clinical research and shadowing that she was doing, thanks to All Grant, helped her on that front. And then lastly, I'm super grateful for the All Grant financial aid program here at Williams because there's just a sense of comfort and belonging that I'm able to feel as I attend college. Instead of having to focus on financial stresses, I can use my time more freely on student organizations, new classes that require more time and work, and even exploring my hobbies as a filmmaker. Also happy to get to Los Angeles, more to see family. It's been an immense impact on their college experience. And that is really just the sentiment that's echoed over and over again from students across campus. And we're really excited as we look ahead to the next couple of years to see just more data on how All Grant is allowing students to make different choices as they think about how they spend their time here and how Williams can launch them into time after college. So I'm going to leave it there, and we're all happy to take questions.
Of the 15,000, I think you said people who applied, and the 550 to 560 that you want, about how many did you actually admit?
Yeah, great question. So, so about 15,500 applied. Williams has had a remarkably steady yield rate for really going back like 40 or 50 years. So that yield rate has hovered somewhere between like 42 and 47%. So we admit typically about 1,200 students of those 15,500 in order to yield the class of 560. Obviously, early decision factors in there as you think about the percentages, but roughly about 1,200.
How does the long-term capital spending needs of the college get reflected in the operating budget, and specifically thinking about future needs, right? What is the right depreciable schedule for different assets? And I'm thinking about the field house, which clearly hasn't had a positive outcome, just in terms of planning ahead for it. Can you just tell me how that you have the right process in place to think about that?
So that's a great question, and I'll start, and then Eiko can chime in. So one of the things that most of higher education, including Williams, has been behind on is renewing some very old buildings. And it's, as a practice, colleges and universities have tended to use buildings for a really long time and then look for gifts to renew those buildings. So we weren't setting aside funding every year as a corporation would to then fund depreciation when they needed to renew a building. And that includes infrastructure as well as functional buildings. So one of the efforts that we've been doing over the last few years is to increase the amount of annual renewal funding that we're setting aside from the operating budget. It's still relatively small. On Eiko's pie chart, you saw two pieces for facilities. One was about $17 million for renewal, and we're committed to increasing that by $500,000 a year, which will grow over time. And then the second piece is debt service, which is about $25 million a year right now, and that's the second piece of our attempt to improve the sustainable energy sources on campus, renew dorms and dining facilities, is to invest a significant amount of capital in borrowing money to improve those facilities and to fundraise for those facilities where we can to make some real significant changes over the next 5 to 10 years. And the debt part will have to become part of the operating budget. So Eiko mentioned that we do 10-year planning. Those debt service payments are included on our 10-year plans.
And so as Mike was saying, the kind of projects that we are planning kind of debt issuance for, one of them is the museum. So the museum, with a budget of $175 million, we are hoping to fundraise about $100 million of that. $75 million would be debt. The other chunk is a kind of $250 million combined for the decarbonization of campus, integrated with dorm renewal. And then also an additional $15 million for dining. And I think with each of these, they're addressing multiple issues. It's not just about buildings. So, clearly with the museum, it's kind of what does this space enable in terms of enhancing arts education at the college. With dorm renewal, we're assessing we are addressing capital renewal needs, but also thinking about what is a really purposeful way to approach what kind of good dorm space should be in terms of building community or encouraging, nurturing student well-being and so on. Also with the decarbonization of campus, really addressing kind of aging infrastructure in terms of our heating system as well.
The other thing you mentioned was the field house, so I just wanted to touch on that quickly. The field house probably would have been part of our well-being and athletics complex project over the next 10 years. So its recent demise makes it more accelerated the need to find a replacement. So you probably are aware that we are going to be building a multi-purpose recreation center toward the north of the tennis courts that will be a long-lived building, but it will only serve as the replacement for the field house for those sports that need winter practice facilities for hopefully in the 10 to 15 year time frame.
Yeah, what's I'm a recovering finance person, so you'll have to pardon me. What's the total cost is the item that you really can manage. What's the percentage growth in the total cost? And I'm usually not used to hearing everything net of inflation, but what's that growth? Because it almost looks like the entire endowment is fully dedicated to supporting the subsidy gap. So when you look at your other expenses coming up, you need initiative funding because it's not obvious that a lot is available out of the endowment. Is that true? And how do you manage the gap? Because that's an item you get to decide what your net tuition is. How do you decide what that gap, what's too much subsidy, what's enough subsidy?
Yeah, we talked this morning about how we make it sound like it's really scientific. There's a fair amount of art to it as well, trying to project forward what's going to be happening with inflation, investment returns, what the needs of the college are. But a really important principle that Eiko touched on was this idea that the current endowment, we're trying to manage it both through the investment of it, which is not what we do, but Abigail Watley does. The investment of it and then the spending of it is designed to keep the ongoing operation of the college the way it is, to continue to support the buildings, the programs, the faculty, the students that we have now in perpetuity. Now that doesn't mean there won't be new programs or new debt, but what it means is that we need to replace, if we're going to be implementing new programs, we might need to look to sunset some other programs in order for the budget to still work. So that's what this 10-year planning allows us to do, is say how much debt capacity do we have within that endowment that we have and that we're anticipating having in the future due to new gifts and new return. But there's some art to it, so I don't know that I'm going to give you a fully satisfactory answer, but when we experience downturns like we have in 2008, 2009, a couple of years ago, we had this positive 49 followed by a negative 12% return. We had to look at the budget really closely, and that's where the priorities of the president and the board and the strategic plan really kick in. We didn't reduce financial aid when we needed to reduce the budget in the last couple of years. We took really hard looks at staff FTEs, really hard look at that discretionary non-compensation budget, and we're constantly looking at what are the things that we can make more effective and more efficient and leave room for those new initiatives. But what would you add, Eiko?
Yeah, I mean, I think every year we just finished our fiscal 25 budget process, and so we're always thinking about what is the kind of growth, annual growth in the operating budget looking like, and we think about that when we deal with all of the pieces of both the expenses and the revenues. So it shapes how we think about what is the staff salary increase going to be, what is the faculty salary increase going to be, what should the manager's budget, what's the kind of guidance should we give to departments about what the manager's budget growth is going to be, and on the revenue side it also informs kind of how we set the comprehensive fee as well, and so it's all the kind of moving parts that we are managing around, such that the endowment plug is, again, over time, not going to be more than 5%. And if you look over time at the endowment avail, it does go above and below. So in 2008, it was well above 5% for a couple years, but then we've got to have a plan to bring it back down so that it's not more than 5 over time.
But the one thing I'll just add, if you don't mind, one quick thing. On a nominal basis, the budget from 24 to 25 will grow by 3.8%, and from 23 to 24, it grew by 3.5%. I don't have the exact number for the last 20 years that would be comparable to that 2.1% real growth, but if you think of inflation was around 2.5 to 3% probably over that time frame, you're talking around 4.5 or so of nominal growth annually in the budget over that time period. But don't quote me on that because I don't actually have the number.
Have you guys considered what will happen if the endowment tax gets passed in Massachusetts, and how is that going to impact us? It's my state representative, by the way, and I chewed him out at the grocery store the other day for a full hour. I think he really rued the day he stopped me on my way in and said, "Oh, have you heard of me?" And I said, "Yeah, I have, and you are so off base with this."
So for those that don't know what this question is, we have a federal excise tax on the endowment, which is 1.4% of certain earnings of the endowment. I won't go into all the nuances, but that costs the college around $1.5 to $2 million a year that comes out of the endowment. In the Commonwealth, there's been a proposal that, as written, would be a tax of 1% of the endowment above $1 billion. So if our endowment, just to make it easy on myself, if our endowment was $4 billion, and you subtract 1, that leaves $3 billion. 1% of that would be a $30 million annual tax that Williams would have to pay, and Harvard's would be a lot more. So we're really hoping they don't pass that. And great question. It would only be those schools with endowments over $1 billion. So in the Commonwealth also. So it's less than 20, I believe. I believe it's less than 20.
4 or 5.
Yeah.
4 or 5, yeah.
Is it that few?
Harvard, MIT, Amherst, Williams.
Amherst, Williams.
Just the colleges,
Just
as
colleges.
far as I know, because what he's saying is that if you bend to his admission criteria and changes, he wouldn't tax you. Or if that's in the bill.
So part of the bill originally said if a college had legacy admissions, and Liz is going to have to bail me out here, but if the college had legacy admissions, it would have to pay a separate tax. That has actually been changed to make it not legal to have legacy admissions, as proposed, if it were to go forward. And would you add to that?
Yeah, no, I think, this is, I think, the greatest frustration that we have. There's so little nuance in the national media about higher ed. And, I think in some ways this endowment tax comes from a place of legislatures wanting colleges to use the resources they do have to provide greater access to students who want to attend college. The reality, of course, is that those of us with these endowments are doing just that. And so, an endowment tax like this really hurts the great work that these well-endowed institutions are doing around access and affordability. But there's just a lot of sort of thinking about among legislators higher ed as a monolith. And so, we've been doing, folks on campus, some good advocacy work around these topics, and others. A colleague of from my office went and spoke with state legislators recently to sort of talk about what expansive financial aid looks like, so that they can understand that we're not just hoarding this money. And what we hear a lot is like building climbing walls and lazy rivers. That's of course not what we're doing, but that's the sort of oversimplification of higher ed in the national. Okay, well, we are building a climbing wall. Turns out we are building a climbing wall. But yeah, you're right, but no lazy rivers.
How are you using data, both past, present, and for forecasting for a lot of the decisions that come across your plate?
The financial decisions?
Yeah, definitely. And especially like with a lot of the programs and the affinity towards like creating that student experience, is that translating into higher growth to the endowment from those students when they graduate? Mm-hmm. Or how does the trends from what maybe employment options, like there was a great article in the Williams Magazine that showed major to career path that I thought was extraordinarily fascinating, and just curious how you're utilizing those trends from like what students are doing once they graduate now to how that's going to impact the future decisions on endowment and admissions. And
yeah, I mean, at the moment, I think our projections, our kind of 10-year projections, are really looking at kind of where we have been, where we are, and what we anticipate our needs to be. So we have now put guidelines in for things like what the growth rate for compensation, for example, or what the kind of growth rates for the manager's budget wedge of the pie, and also being able to pay the annual payments on the debt that we plan to issue. So all of that is part of our modeling exercise. We haven't really thought about things like career choice, career paths, in part because it's a little bit hard, especially at this moment. These are the classes that have been affected by COVID. Their experience has really been impacted a lot and disrupted in a lot of ways by COVID. We are also, I think, continuing to work on outreach to our more recent alumni. So I am not, from the financial modeling perspective, I wouldn't have a great sense of confidence about actually being able to model what that looks like. We do have a kind of assumption about what will happen with annual giving, but I would be a little bit cautious about the kind of level of confidence.
And historically, so you said the alumni fund, the parents fund, all goes directly towards the operating budget. So what has actually been gifts to endowment? What is the trend on the gifts to endowment been? What's it run at? And then I'm sure that's in some report that I haven't read, what's the return on the endowment historically? What's the longer term?
So we, historically, and as a rough assumption, we use between $20 and $25 million annually for new gifts to the endowment. But a lot of those gifts lead to new spending, right? Those are not all unrestricted. So sometimes it's a new gift for a new program, so that adds to spending. But that is the assumption that we use for part of our 10-year modeling. The 20-year nominal return on the endowment is 9.5%. And remember, the goal is 5% real. So they're trying to beat inflation by 5% over the long term. Doesn't happen every year. The last 2 years it didn't happen. But over the long term, they try to beat inflation by that 5% distribution rate.
It sounds like that if you looked over the last 20 years, which I know have been very successful for the endowment, you've sort of gotten, I'm guessing, 2 to 3% above.
Roughly. And you're right, it's been very good endowment years and relatively low inflation until the last 2 years.
And back to the modeling question, what we're kind of, our return assumption going forward is 7% nominal.
What's the debt is secured by the assets of the endowment, or is it also secured by the ability of the college to raise tuition?
The college's debt is unsecured. It's a AA plus credit with that $3.5 billion endowment, so our investors do not have a lot of worry about our ability to repay.
It's tax exempt, it falls in the muni bucket.
Correct.
And as debt matures, the idea is it didn't look like that was amortizing debt. It looks like it's like you're just going to have these big balloon payments.
Yeah, so I didn't get into that upper graph that had all the bars. That was the annual maturities. So our debt has a 2.2% effective interest rate and a duration of 12 years. So 2.2 seems really great in the current environment, but the 12-year duration means that we have a fair amount of debt that's going to need to be refinanced. We have about $75 to $90 million that is at less than 1% that will have to be refinanced in the next year, and we're pretty certain we're not going to get less than 1% for that debt. So that factors into our planning as well. So we're always, again, art as much as science, trying to figure out the right mix of low interest, long duration, and principal repayments. I've always committed myself not to sticking that future CFO with the debt that they're going to have to refund at those higher rates.
So I guess as a cousin to that, because and to Catherine's question about, there's these things on the horizon, whether it's another pandemic, a big tax. I mean, do you regularly have a piece of the operating budget that's like, this has to go away? Like, I mean, how, because you can't plan for everything, and there are these shocks. And I'm curious, and I noticed that in 2008, and then again, post-pandemic, there was drops to our spending. What were those then, and what do you foresee them to be? Not to go dark, but like, I'm curious, like, what could be on the chopping block?
Yeah, I mean, what we did in 2008 is similar to the kind of dials that we have to turn now. So there was a freezing of salaries. There was cuts in the managers' budgets. We froze a lot of capital renewal. Now, that's the kind of thing that you're going to have to pay for later on, but in that moment, that's what we did. Obviously, the debt payments you have to continue to pay for. And then, so those are really the main things that we would have to look at. We did have to do other things, more serious things in 2008, which was, for example, go back on our no loan program. We had committed to no loan, different from all grant, but we had gone no loan then, and had to walk back that commitment in the wake of the financial crisis. But those are the main dials that we'd have to turn. That is kind of compensation, manager's budget, any building projects that we'd have to put on hold, slowing capital renewal. Those would be the main things that we'd have to do.
Time for one last question.
Yeah, Jim?
maintenance. You had mentioned that we had fallen behind, or we weren't actively trying to do a lot with it, but now you've got a schedule that is putting money against that. What's the total nut? If you were to estimate what would have to be funded, what's that number?
Yeah, I don't want to try to get too precise with it, but I'll say range of magnitude $250 million if we were to try to catch up all at once.
Quick last question. Is there a way to cultivate or nurture gifting amongst the students so that they understand how much the school relies upon it, and even kids whose families are paying full freight? Whether is there a way to kind of nurture that along the way so it's not just a big surprise that there's an expectation or a need for it, especially the kids are all benefiting.
Yeah, I think that's a question for Laura.
Trying to get everyone involved.
Yes, absolutely. It's actually one of the really interesting things over the last several years. We've been thinking a lot about that, and actually took an existing FTE and restructured it to work with both, this is within the Alumni Engagement Office, has responsibilities for the senior class gift and the Alumni Fund within the youngest alumni, to rather than having that person just work with the 10 youngest classes of alumni, actually have them work with the 5 youngest classes and the 4 years that are on campus. So that person has only been in that role for about 18 months, and so they're still building out what that really looks like, but the goal is to have a really comprehensive 4-year experience as a student that includes opportunities to learn more and really have a better understanding of all the ways in which alumni support the institution, and which as they graduate and become alums, they will also be invited to do so, whether that's through staying informed on what's going on campus, whether that's through coming to events like this to learn more about that, whether that's providing service in the form of volunteer opportunities, or whether that's through philanthropy.
Right. And also, isn't there some disparity between gifting amongst genders also that's is being worked on?
So interestingly, this is a topic that I'd love to talk about. I'm happy to do so offline. Where we have seen gaps in gender as far as relates to giving is actually not at a participation level and also not at a major gift level, but rather at the leadership gifts to the Alumni Fund and Parents Fund. So there is a concerted effort, particularly within the Alumni Fund side of things, to try to reach gender parity, so to increase the percent of donors making leadership gifts of $2,500 or more who identify as female. Thank you, Liz, Eiko, and Mike. Thank you, everyone, for great questions. We'll take a brief break and then be back with Pamela Franks. Thank you.